Everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about how to read your child's evaluation because I get a lot of calls from parents who have had an evaluation and they're not real sure what is in there. And sometimes evaluators will do the evaluation and they'll just send it to you without going over it, or maybe they did go over it, but it's really hard to remember because a lot of the things that we put in these evaluations are very specific to this type of evaluation. You're not going to look and see these scores on state testing or things like that. So it's really hard when it's not something that you do all the time. So today we're going to run through it so that you understand what's there. And then you'll be able to refer back to this video as if you get another evaluation, things like that. Now, I pulled pieces of lots of evaluations that I have done, and I took out a lot of the descriptors because they're personal. So if you had an evaluation by me, this is not it. Just so you know, if you see anything that the tables I did pull from different evaluations, but it's certainly not descriptive of any one kid. So everybody's information is confidential here at Academic Insights. But let's get to it. So the first part of an evaluation will just have some identifying information there at the top. And most of the time your evaluations are going to go in this order. If you have it from different places, it's going to look a little bit different, but you should see these pieces. Reason for referral is just why you're there. If it was a school referral, they may have some information about what was going on at school. If it was a private evaluation, the evaluator should have just said, like, what brought you in. And then conditions for assessment is just where we usually say things like we use standard assessment protocols. And we'll talk about the rapport that we built with the student and if there was anything crazy that happened during testing that would have caused us to negate some of the scores, we would write about that here. So if there was a fire drill that interrupted a processing speed subtest and we had to spoil it out, we would talk about it here. Or if there were some behaviors by the student that impacted scoring and we want it to be viewed that way, we would talk about it here. Next is a sources of data table. Basically, it's a list of what was done, who did the thing, and the date. So here you'll just see a list of things that might be in an eval. In the sociological section, again, I've taken out identifying information. So it would just talk about your family life here. So if there was anything significant, if you are providing for outside tutoring, or if your family is really active in any kind of organization, that might be here. Or if there's been any changes in the family life that would impact your child, that would be here. So if there was a recent separation or any major illnesses in the family, we would talk about that here. And the reason we do that is that if we're looking at things like a learning disability, or there's another explanation for maybe a temporary dip in our achievement, we would want to know about it so we can consider it when we're looking at the other data. School history, this is where we would talk about what schools your child has attended. Did they go to pre-K? Have they attended since kindergarten? And how's their attendance? So if we have a child who misses school quite a bit, we would want to view the data of how they're achieving in that light. And then we would make a statement about whether or not the sociological factors are positively or negatively impacting that child. Some of you may have a really long physical section. In this section, this is where we put developmental factors, things like chronic conditions. If you had an occupational therapy evaluation, we would write about it here. If you had a physical therapy evaluation, we would write about it here. If your child has a medical condition that would qualify for one of those 13 disabilities under the law, we would write about it here. So for example, if your child has epilepsy or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, we would have sent what's called an OHI or other health impairment form to your doctor. and we would have the information from the doctor here. Same with if your child has a traumatic brain injury or orthopedic impairment. All of that information should be written up at length here. For language, if you had formal speech evaluation, that would be here. For this test case, we did, we put in, well, there would be parent information, teacher information, and then assessment observations. So this is if I'm doing the language testing. If I, the diagnostician, am doing the language testing, typically that means we don't have that many concerns about language. Where I have assessment observations, I would write, how the child engaged in, how the child was able to engage in conversation during my testing, anything that I observed to that nature. If you had a speech evaluation, they may call this a communication sample, and it would be very long. Standardized assessment. So on all of the evaluations that I do, I report a standard score. For most professionals, 85 to 115 on a standard score is going to be considered within normal limits. Now, there is some interpretation to be done for scores under 90 and scores over 110. And then I always report a descriptive category. That descriptive category in my reports comes from the test publisher. And you'll see that test publishers tend to call those outlier scores, those scores that are outside of 90 to 110, they'll call them different things. In general, most publishers are going to call 90 to 110 average. So for this child, oral language was within normal limits, is what these scores tell us. Now, a lot of diagnosticians are going to report a percentile rank. That's just another way of looking at the scores. And a lot of parents will get kind of hung up on, so say here, we scored a 91, but that percentile rank was a 27. And as parents, if it's below 50, a lot of parents will worry about a bit. This is just, so remember, these scores are, and I've got at the end the bell curve. These tests are formulated so that most kids are going to score in the big part of the bell curve. So for our purposes, 27th percentile is within that expected range, the range that the test has been manipulated. So most kids that age are going to score within that range. Okay. For emotional behavioral, if you had a formal psychological, these sections would be long. So there would be a long write-up about whatever conversation you had with the psychologist. There would be a write-up about what the teacher's interview was with the psychologist, what they said about your child. And then if the child's old enough, there would be a student interview, and that would be written up. And sometimes the psychologist will sit in on testing. In my clinic, the psychologist will sit in on the testing and write some observations about the testing. In this section, you may also see classroom observations. So if your evaluation was done through a school district, there's usually some classroom observations that the psychologist writes up. Or it might be that if you had some private testing, sometimes my testing that will go to a school to observe if the private schools will let us, or sometimes a public school. So now I'm going to show you what the rating scales look like in a psychological evaluation, and they're a bit different. So this is a BASC-3, a behavior assessment system for children. It's one that's widely used, and so what you'll see is for them, and I love the way my psychologists write these up. They put these asterisks next to them to show you the clinical significance. And at the bottom of this chart, they're giving you that range. So on this scale, clinically significant is over 70. At risk is 60 to 69, and then 59 and below is going to be within normal limits, except for the adaptive scales. And it's really confusing. So hopefully on your assessment, you've got something like this, and they're using those asterisks to show you at risk and clinically significant. So here you can see, this is just example of a spread in scores. And so, and since I pulled in charts from different evaluations, none of this is indicative of anything at the moment, but just to show you what these scores might look like. Here's another example of a scale that a psychologist might use. So again, those scores over 70 are clinically significant, and between 60 and 69 at risk. So on our evaluations, we're marking those with asterisks. And then the Conners gives an ADHD index of a likelihood that that child has ADHD. So those are just two examples, but just kind of how to read those scores. Here's an academic section. Again, you would have usually in a real report, these records, this would be longer. I would have things from state testing or report cards, anything that you had provided for consideration. And then these are just more examples of scores that you might see and how they might be described. So here on the TOD, they're calling those scores in the 80s below average. And that's just helps us to look at the scores. Now, a lot of times you will, in reports, you won't see that descriptive category. But if you, and I'll show you, and I'll upload a bell curve so you have it for reference. Just kind of think about it that way. In general, almost everybody's going to say 90 to 110 is average. A lot of clinicians are going to say 85 to 115. And then the farther you get outside of those numbers, the less likely it becomes. And so that's basically what these percentile ranks are telling us. How likely is it that that score would occur? And then I want to show you, so here's an example. This is the TOD. We'll just scroll on through these. These are just examples of tests. Now I want to show you a cognitive. Now, people do get kind of confused about a full scale IQ. A full scale IQ usually doesn't take into account every subtest you're seeing. So a full scale IQ is a composite. And so these test publishers have picked in their batteries tests that to them show the wide range of cognitive ability. A lot of times we'll see that there's more weight on verbal comprehension and fluid reasoning, problem-solving skills that goes into this score because they have put more of those tests into the composite. So here on the WISC, which is a popular battery to use, you'll see similarities in vocabulary both go into this score. Only one visual spatial processing is going in. 2 of the fluid reasoning subtests are going to be counted. And then 1 working memory and 1 processing speed. None of the long-term retrieval subtests go towards those scores. And so these ones that aren't marked, they're not going into this composite score. And then whenever you're seeing these composites for each of these numbers, so visual spatial reasoning, this isn't a subtest. This is taking into account these 2 tests. And so the test publisher does generate these composite scores based on how likely it is that these 2 scores would occur together. So it's not an average, right? Because if you average these scores, you're not going to get the composites. The other thing is, so the WISC-5 generates on these individual subtests, it's giving us a scaled score. So scaled scores are these over here, and they're smaller numbers, basically. They have equivalents of a standard score, and I always give the equivalent. But know that when scaled score is what is generated by the test, it's limited to these over here that are in the parentheses. So For example, this child scored a 9 on similarities, and I converted that to a 95 just for ease of comparison for the parent. And you may see just these scaled scores in your report. Um, it's important to remember that like this kid could not score a 96 on similarities because only standard or only scaled scores are what's generated by the test. Now the test does take these scaled scores and they generate a standard score for the uh, the cluster score, so the composite score. I hope that this is not confusing. We may want to do one of these on the live so that you guys can ask questions as we go. Then there's usually a bit of a write-up. This is adaptive behavior. Adaptive behavior usually has those same standard scores or scaled scores. So here you can see for the individual skills, you've got scaled scores in there. And then for the composite, you'll see these standard scores. So for this one, I had one teacher rater over here, and I've got the descriptive categories that come from this particular rating scale. And then here are the ratings for the parent. If you see one of these, you probably filled out a really long rating scale. And then there'll be a write-up about what all of that means. There'll be something about assistive technology, just evaluating whether or not your child needs things like communication devices in the classroom. And then at the end, you're going to see a summary. And you should see some sort of summary from everyone who did an evaluation. I only put a few in here. But you know, if they evaluated for intellectual disability, you should see a write-up of what that is and why or why not the child meets criteria. If they evaluated for ADD or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or there was a psychological evaluation, you should see a summary of that and why or why not that child meets criteria. Same for specific learning disabilities. So all of those areas that a child can qualify under the law, you should see some sort of summary and telling you why or why not that child is meeting criteria according to this evaluation and what data they use for that. When they're doing conclusions, the only two things that cannot be comorbid or cannot occur together are a specific learning disability and an intellectual disability. And if you want to talk more, I'm happy to explain why that is. But anything else can occur together. So, you know, a child can have a specific learning disability and autism. A child can have an intellectual disability and autism or ADHD and any of those things. So just keep in mind if they tell you, you know, that they can't, they can. And then the last thing you'll see is that there should be some sort of recommendation for disability conditions if they're qualifying with anything. These are just examples, and then a whole list of recommendations for home and school. So a lot of times on a school eval, these recommendations are going to be very heavy on things to do at school. Every once in a while, they'll give you some recommendations at home, which I think is why a lot of you are here. You're not, you know, if you're being helped with the school, maybe you don't have that many recommendations for home, but you can always look at these for ideas of how you can intervene at home. And then there should be signatures of the people who evaluated. Here is that example of a bell curve, and I will definitely upload this for you so you have it for reference while you're looking at your child's report. Okay, so I hope that helped. That was very short and fast. So definitely write down your questions about reading and evaluation. Look over your child's using what I just gave you. And then I'm excited to talk to you about it in the Q&A this week. Have a great day.